Explorers, warriors, wolves among men. In the Dark Ages, Vikings in their dragon ships came howling out of the frozen north to take what was theirs with fire and blood. These were the days of hard men, men who would not be tamed, men who forged bloodlines to last 1,000 years. Strong men need a strong drink, and now you can continue the Viking tradition with new pre-mixed cosmopolitans Beyond the Rocks. Brewed with premium vodka, triple sec, fresh lime, and cranberry juice as red as blood. This Leif Erikson Day, make your drink of choice pre-mixed cosmopolitans and release the beast inside you.
Another year, another Leif Erikson Day. I hope each and every one of you, even the losers and haters, are spending this Leif Erikson Day in good health and great happiness. Today, we celebrate the virtues of curiosity, adventurousness, and good-natured bravado that first brought the Greenland Norse to these shores in days of old. Let the spirit of the holiday imbue those virtues within you, and carry them with you not just today, but every day, as you embark on the great voyage of life. This year, we're going to cover one of the most dramatic and compelling episodes in the written history of the Norse exploration of North America, the fateful voyage of Freydis Eriksdottir, sister of Leif Erikson and daughter of Eric the Red. Now, this was not Freydis' first appearance in the Sagas. If you'll remember, she played a very memorable role in the Saga of Eric the Red, when she and her husband accompanied Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition of attempted colonization. The saga tells us that during a desperate battle with a Native American war party, Freydis saved the day by picking up a sword and repeatedly smacking her bare breasts with it, which apparently was enough to make the native warriors flee in terror. The Saga of Eric the Red doesn't give us much information about Freydis beyond that, apart from briefly mentioning that she was illegitimate, a bastard daughter of Eric, which may or may not be true. And it makes no mention at all of Freydis launching an expedition of her own. For that story, we need to turn to our other Vinland saga, written about a century earlier, the Saga of the Greenlanders. The Saga of the Greenlanders tells us that shortly after the return of Thorfinn Karlsefni's Vinland expedition, two brothers named Helgi and Finnbogi also arrived in Greenland. The saga tells us that Helgi and Finnbogi were from the east coast of Iceland, but beyond that they're a bit of a mystery. Various online sources claim that the brothers were merchants by trade, but I don't know where they got that information because it's not in the saga. However, it's pretty clear that these two were wealthy men of high status. They were co-captains of a ship and were pretty well traveled, having come to Greenland from Norway. And that may very well explain why Freydis decided to visit the brothers one day to persuade them to join her in an exciting new business opportunity, voyaging to Vinland in search of fame and fortune. It's easy to imagine Freydis captivating Helgi and Finnbogi with thrilling tales of the three expeditions that had gone before. There was Leif's initial voyage west, which had given the Norse world its first glimpse of the abundant natural resources of North America. Then there was her other brother Thorvald's misadventures among the strange and fearsome natives. And finally, Thorfinn Karlsefni's epic 3 years of attempted colonization. The fact that those last two voyages ended in failure was very likely not a deterrent for Helgi and Finnbogi. On the contrary, in the frontier culture of the Norse North Atlantic, reputation was everything, and social standing was predicated on great feats and achievements. The more dangerous and daring, the better. Freydis and the brothers agreed to split all the profits of the voyage between them, 50-50. The saga suggests that the main resource they were after was lumber. As soon as the proverbial ink was dry, Freydis asked Leif for permission to utilize his settlement at Leifsbuther, or Leif's houses in Vinland, which may be the Lonso Meadows site in Newfoundland. Leif agreed, and Freydis and Helgi and Finnbogi set sail in 2 ships with crews of 30 men each, bound for Vinland. So let's pause the narrative here real quick. It's worth noting that what Freydis is doing here is pretty unusual for a woman in her culture. Not unheard of, but unusual. While women definitely had it better in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic than they did in contemporary insular or continental Europe, let's not forget that this is still a highly patriarchal society. Women were almost universally prohibited from leadership roles in Norse culture, and organizing a for-profit expedition was quite simply not something a woman was supposed to do. And the saga seemingly punishes her for it. We're told that Freydis was a domineering woman who wore the pants in her marriage. Her husband, Thorvard of Gardar, say that 10 times fast, was a man with great wealth who owned a prosperous farmstead, but we're told that he was a weakling, a feeble man of no consequence, and Freydis was only married to him for his money. It's also telling that even though Thorvard accompanied Freydis to Vinland and probably put up her share of the expenses, Freydis was the unquestioned captain of her ship and leader of her crew. The saga writer's contempt for Thorvard is a great demonstration of how rigid Norse gender roles were for men in particular. Like, this guy is wealthy, he's a landowner, he's a chieftain, but he's also kind of a wet noodle, or maybe a bit effeminate, so according to this culture, that just makes him worthless. And since Freydis is destined to play a villainous part in this story, the saga writer immediately puts a bad taste in his readers' mouths by attributing her with the traditionally masculine traits of charisma and entrepreneurship. Now, the Icelandic sagas as a whole are full of female characters who fight duels or lead armies or otherwise challenge the mores of their gender, and the story doesn't present this as a bad thing. In fact, the authors of those sagas often seem to celebrate them for it. But we should distinguish between the reality of Viking Age Norse culture on one hand and the later literary tradition of Icelandic saga writing on the other. And we should further distinguish between the highly mythological and fantastical sagas, told and retold primarily as a form of entertainment, and the more realistic, plausible sagas intended as familial and cultural histories. The 13th century saga of Hervor and Heydrich, for example, revels in the exploits of its female lead as she disguises herself as a man to go on adventures as a warrior. But the saga of Hervor and Heydrich also has magic swords, and barrow wights, and Tolkien-esque dwarves. Odin shows up at one point. There's all sorts of crazy shit. Whereas the saga of the Greenlanders is about a family who goes sailing. It was written early in the saga age, before a lot of fantasy tropes started entering the genre. And furthermore, some of it is corroborated by archaeological evidence in Newfoundland and Greenland. So, in my inexpert opinion, admittedly, Saga of the Greenlanders probably reflects Viking Age gender roles a little more accurately than those later sagas. But that's not the only possibility. The guy who wrote Saga of the Greenlanders might have just been a huge misogynist, and his personal bias is clouding everything. Who fucking knows? Now, if you know much about Viking stuff, you're probably shouting at the screen, "What about the Birka Shield Maiden?" And yeah, archaeologists did find a Viking Age warrior with 2 X chromosomes, buried in an honored location in an exceptionally elaborate grave filled with weapons, horses, and all the trappings of command in the east of Sweden. This may indicate that biological females could exhibit a range of gender expressions in Norse culture, and further excavations in the future may prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. But I'm skeptical. There are just too many unknowns and alternate possibilities. It could very well be an isolated case of one extraordinary individual. Or, since many of the grave goods are associated with the warrior elite of the Eurasian steppes, this gender expression may indicate a Russian cultural influence rather than an indigenous Norse one. Or, as some academics have suggested, this person might have been what we would classify today as transgender. And if they had completely taken on a man's social role, then as a warrior, they were actually reinforcing gender roles, not subverting them. Now, don't mistake me here. I'm not saying that Freydis's girl boss ways are the reason she's determined to prove a villain. In fact, it's the least of her villainy. But for this culture, it's still weird and off-putting. It's like Homelander doing that creepy thing with the milk. It's there to tell you, as an audience member, that there's something off about this person, that you've got to watch out for them. I think that little detail about her being domineering and ambitious, especially in the context of her marriage to an inadequate man, is there for a reason. After all, it's the very first thing the saga writer tells us about her. And, as the 2 ships of Freydis and Helgi and Finnbogi neared the coast of Vinland, the saga reveals that Freydis was not only greedy and perversely masculine, but deceitful and unscrupulous as well. Before setting sail, she had agreed with the brothers that they would bring crews of 30 men in each of their ships, but Freydis hired 5 more men behind their back, which Helgi and Finnbogi didn't discover until after they had gotten to Vinland. Furthermore, upon their arrival at Leifsbuther, Freydis insisted that Leif had lent the settlement to her, not to the brothers, and forced their crew to build their own shelter some distance inland. So right off the bat, Freydis is just a nightmare of a business partner, and the crews of the 2 ships are physically separated in different dwellings. The battle lines are being drawn for a coming conflict. But to their credit, Helgi and Finnbogi repeatedly tried to ameliorate the situation. As the long North Atlantic winter set in and work ground to a halt, the brothers suggested that the two crews meet for games and other entertainments to help pass the time. Freydis initially agreed, but the saga tells us that it wasn't long before trouble broke out at one of these gatherings. What kind of trouble, we don't know, but it's easy to imagine that given the way Freydis mistreated Helgi and Finnbogi's crew, the atmosphere at these game nights was probably pretty tense, with a lot of feigned politeness and unspoken antagonism. The friendly competition may have gotten ugly as tensions between the two parties bubbled over, leading to crew members coming to blows, or maybe even drawing knives. Whatever happened, it was egregious enough that all visiting between the two settlements ceased for the rest of the winter. Then, one day, some months later, Freydis got up early in the morning and put on her husband Thorvard's cloak. Symbolism much, but did not put on any shoes, and walked barefoot to Helgi and Finnbogi's encampment. She found Finnbogi already awake, and bade him come outside to talk. Probably to Finnbogi's great surprise, Freydis expressed regret for the part she had played in the ill feeling between them, and announced her intention to return to Greenland. To that end, she proposed switching ships with the brothers, since theirs was bigger, so she and her larger crew could sail home in greater comfort. Finnbogi agreed, and must have felt a huge weight lifted as he went back to bed. Finally, the brothers would be free of their psycho business partner. But Freydis had other plans. She returned home and climbed into bed with Thorvard, who woke with a start as soon as he felt her ice-cold feet brush up against him. He asked why Freydis was so cold and wet. She replied that she had gone to visit Helgi and Finnbogi to ask to buy their ship, but they had gotten angry and beat her and treated her very roughly. Freydis called Thorvard a coward and insisted that if he didn't avenge this insult, she would divorce him. Again, as strict as female gender roles probably were for Norse women, Norse men had it 1,000 times worse. And with Thorvard here, we see a man imprisoned by societal expectations of masculinity. Now, we might think it's a universal constant for someone to want to avenge violence done to their loved ones, and yeah, that's absolutely true. But in the Norse cultural context, Thorvard literally has no choice but to go in guns blazing. Like, you'd think at this point it would be smart to take a beat and think, okay, maybe I should get to the bottom of this before I start swinging a sword around. Besides, Freydis has been untruthful and erratic this whole voyage, whereas Helgi and Finnbogi have been very measured and reasonable. But whether the beating happened or not is irrelevant in this situation. Norse men attacked the wives, sisters, and mothers of other men in order to dishonor them. In an attack like this, or even a sexual assault, the men were understood to be the intended victims of the violence. So by humiliating Freydis, the brothers are posing a direct challenge to Thorvard. And maybe if this had happened to Leif or Karlsefni, confidently masculine Norse elites, then they would have paused to investigate the accusation or formed a sneaky plan to serve their revenge up cold. But Thorvard cannot afford to do that. He's already viewed as weak and effeminate by his culture and community. Saving face and maintaining honor as a man is his first priority here. The truth of the accusation a distant second. Thorvard's inability to live up to the standards of masculinity of his culture is his defining trait, and it's what drove him to swift and brutal violence. So Thorvard woke his men and armed up, and went straight to Helgi and Finnbogi's houses. They broke in while the brothers' crew was still sleeping, tied them up, and hauled them outside. There, Thorvard killed Helgi and Finnbogi, along with all their men. There were 5 women with the brothers' crew, and Freydis insisted that they be put to death as well. But this was a bridge too far for Thorvard. He had avenged his honor and then some, and just wanted the bloodshed to end. So Freydis took up an axe and hacked all the women to death herself. After she killed the women, Freydis led Thorvard and her crew back to Leifsbuther and told them she'd kill anyone who breathed a word of what had happened. The story they'd tell people in Greenland was that Helgi and Finnbogi had decided to stay behind. But upon their return with a ship laden with goods, word of the murder spread anyway, and eventually reached Leif, who was horrified. He seized and tortured 3 of Freydis' men to get to the bottom of it, and found that their stories matched exactly. Leif decided to show mercy on his sister, and allowed Freydis to live in peace with Thorvard at their farm at Gardar. But a dark cloud would hang over their descendants for generations. Sadly, we will probably never know how true this episode of Saga of the Greenlanders is to the real events of Freydis Eriksdottir's voyage to Vinland. But true or not, it's a thrilling story of honor, adventure, and murder, with deeply flawed and compelling characters worthy of a great Shakespearean tragedy. So, Believe it or not, this is our 4th Leif Erikson Day special here at Atun-Shei Films. And at this point, we've covered all of the Norse voyages to America as related in the Vinland sagas. But that, my friends, is only the beginning. There are tons of other aspects of the Norse exploration of North America to cover, from archaeology to historiography to cultural legacy, from stories of Norse-Inuit conflict in Greenland in the High Middle Ages to deep dives into the lives of the 11th century native peoples that the Eriksons may have met in their adventures. The possibilities are endless. But I guess we shall have to just wait and see what the future may bring. For now, it's time to say goodbye. This year, I want all you boys to drink cosmopolitans and practice satyr magic. What, satyr magic's too girly for you? Tell that to fucking Odin. Skål!